What's up, friends? Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Man, can I just say, I'm just speaking off the cuff here. It is such a privilege and honor to be able to do this work. I love it. I love having these conversations. I love bringing you guests that I hope is helping you in your journey into the Christian tradition and just kind of understanding the world around us. So thanks for letting me do this. I really appreciate it. And it is truly a privilege. On this episode, I brought on Samuel Perry again. Now, Samuel Perry is a sociologist. And honestly, friends, he is on the forefront of giving us data about Christian nationalism. How do we define it? What's the percentage of the population in America that pushes Christian nationalism? All that kind of stuff. He is truly on the cutting edge, him and his team and his fellow researchers. So I'm bringing you a top-notch guest today. This is someone that you really want to listen to. He knows what he's talking about. He has really carved in sociology this path of tracking Christian nationalism and how it affects our population. So we talk about all kinds of things. What is Christian nationalism? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? The power dynamics in play, how it's attached to white evangelicalism, but is not just white evangelicalism. So there's so much here. So buckle up. This is a really good episode full of data. And Samuel, if you're listening, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. That being said, as always, friends, I want to say thank you for sharing the podcast. If you want to support the work that we do, we're able to bring you these guests because people donate to make this work happen. That's how I'm able to schedule these calls. That's how I'm able to make it all happen. So if you go to the show notes and go to the link there, you can donate. It helps us do our work. You can also share our content, which also helps get the word out. And thank you, by the way, this is your first time listening. Thanks for listening. It means so much. You're in for a real treat of an episode. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Mad Priest Coffee. We are huge fans. They make, or roast, I should say, not make, but they roast amazing coffee. They poke a little bit of fun of our own evangelical heritage. They are always trying to fight for good causes like resisting Christian nationalism. So make sure you check them out. You can click on the link in our show notes. If you type in TNE20 at the checkout, you'll get 20% off your order. Isn't that great? Who doesn't love 20% off great, delicious coffee? So make sure you go support them. Also, I've been told that they, I should say they are in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I've been told I'm saying it wrong because I'm a northerner. So I believe the way to say it is Chattanooga. I hope I'm saying that correctly, friends. If I'm not, I'm sorry. But either way, go buy some coffee from Mad Priest Coffee. And secondly, we are going to Homebrewed Theology's Theology Nerd Beer Camp Godpod Edition with Trip Fuller, Pete Enns, Brian McLaren, Dr. Robin Henderson Espinoza, all kinds of amazing scholars. You can get tickets at the link in our show notes. Type in TNE for $50 off your ticket. All right, friends, without further ado, here is my interview with Samuel Perry. It's a great one. Buckle up. Here we go. Well, Samuel Perry, it is good to see you again. I had you on 6 months ago, and I messaged you and said, hey, you want to come back on and talk? You said, how about today? I said, I'll make it happen. So here we are. It's good to see you.
Hey, great to be here.
For the sake of our audience, can you just let them know what you do? You briefly, why would I have you on the show? I think once you explain what you do, it will make a lot of sense.
Sure. So I'm a sociologist of American religion, and have been studying white Christian nationalism for the past 7 years. And I would say our contribution to that really exploding area of interest for a lot of academics has been we're among the only I think academics that have sought to collect national data on the scope of this phenomenon. So there's been a lot of research into the history of Christian nationalism, which is really important. A lot of research into even some experimental designs and kind of looking at white Christian nationalist ideology. And I think even critical studies and media studies and those kinds of things, I think we as social scientists, sociologists in particular, we have sought to understand with survey data, how broad is this phenomenon of Christian nationalist ideology, and how does it influence other factors like views about voting, views about COVID, views about authoritarian violence and racism and those kinds of things. And so I think we have sought to make that our contribution.
Well, I got to be honest, I'm really not blowing smoke here, but your data and contributions, I just feel like are so necessary with the people that you work with. I know Andrew Whitehead and Philip Gorski. You do a lot of work with those folks and just doing the research. And it's so needed, because I feel like for me, there's this sense of something feels way wrong, but I can't quantify it. I don't know if it's just my bubble. I don't know if I'm living in a place that really is fringe, and having data just to say, hey, either you're on or you're off. Like, hey, maybe actually, Tim, your feeling is off here, or actually it's confirmed. It's helpful because it grounds us somewhere. So, truly you can say, I cite your work often on Instagram. In fact, I did yesterday. I used your language of what you call accommodators of Christian nationalism versus ambassadors, trying to kind of paint the picture that between, and we can dig into this briefly, but between the ambassadors of Christian nationalism and the accommodators, the majority of white evangelical spaces really are pushing that way between the two. And that's helpful to know. And it's helpful to tell the audience, hey guys, what you're seeing is not fringe. Because I think that I hear that often from some people. Not all churches, this is fringe. Well, the data seems to suggest otherwise.
Right.
Um,
Right. So and to that point, I think you bring up something that we try to underscore a lot, in that Christian nationalism is best thought of as a spectrum.
right.
Not something like a clinical category, like all of a sudden you've just fallen into like you're full on Christian nationalist because you believe this kind of thing.
Right.
It's not like that. It's not like you're in a self-identifying club, because with the exception of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, very few people want to loudly and proudly call themselves Christian nationalists, and so most Americans and most evangelicals, I'll give it as a good example. It's good to think of them in terms of like white evangelicals, especially, by and large, do buy into this ideology. Not all of them, a lot of them reject that, but you have people that are ambassadors, meaning they're kind of already activated. They're kind of very much true believers of this ideology. But then you have those accommodators that are kind of friendly to Christian nationalism and could be activated, given the right kind of like fear, anger, misinformation, and mobilized to, I think, push that kind of agenda. But they don't have to be, right? So like I always kind of, and maybe I'm just kind of telling positive things to myself about white evangelicals, but I want to believe that the accommodators in that group are persuadable. That with the right kind of information, with there's a guy named Josh Compton, who's a scholar of communication theory at Dartmouth, and he's one of the leading thinkers of something called inoculation theory. And communication is basically this idea that like you can actually fight misinformation by inoculating people against it, by like actually preparing them for that kind of disinformation battle and giving them correct information about certain things. And I like to think that on multiple fronts that we can fight for those accommodators that, they understand there's some kind of relationship between Christian values and American politics that they feel inclined to like promote. I get that. And yet they don't want to go full on like institutionalizing Christian privilege in legal frameworks,
Yeah. For our conversation, can you just give a brief definition of Christian nationalism and how you define it for your work?
Yeah, absolutely. We always try to be really careful about defining Christian nationalism, because one of the things that we want to fight against, and this is going to happen. So like we recognize this, we want to fight against Christian nationalism becoming a slur for any kind of like conservative Christian thing that you don't like. I get that, right? Like I'm appalled when that happens with critical race theory, or people throw around wokeness or some stupid term like that, and it's used as a disparaging kind of thing to mean anything left of me.
Right.
I don't want Christian nationalism to be the opposite of that.
Right.
So Christian nationalism, as I define it, is both an ideology on the one hand, but it's also a political strategy. So let me go about the ideology. So the ideology is that it idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of Christianity. And when I say particular kind of Christianity, I mean not that you have given your life over to Jesus or that you want to be a disciple of Jesus. It very much so is code language for people like us. Right? It means our kind of Christian, our kind of American. Right. That usually means ethnically, if not racially white. It means natural born. It means conservative traditional values, most likely Republican, capitalist, those kinds of like identities.
Yeah.
So they want to fuse American civic life with that kind of Christianity, legally, institutionally, symbolically, in our history or our nation's myths, all those kinds of things. That is a sense like people can more or less embrace that ideology. We try to measure that like on a spectrum with various survey instruments. The other kind of Christian nationalism we can talk about, though, is Christian nationalism as a political strategy. This really doesn't require you to buy into Christian nationalism ideology at all, because like I think Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene are good examples of this. Marjorie Taylor Greene may actually believe it, but Trump, I don't think Trump believes much of anything. I think he believes in himself. He believes in winning.
Right.
He believes in winners and losers and you know, and ratings and things like that.
Yeah.
But he does know that Christian nationalism plays well. And he knows that there are a group of people who believe that ideology. And so he can use that rhetorically to try to whip up anger, fear, anxiety about Christians' place in the country and their position. And so when people are kind of like on social media and they're like, hey, is this Christian nationalism? You know, like oftentimes what they're looking at is they're looking at kind of like a rhetorical tactic to try to whip that up. And to appeal to some kind of Christian heritage or Christian values or that kind of thing. And often what we're looking at in the survey data is the ideology itself of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And then I think it is important, because as we do this work as well, we don't want to become, like, frankly speaking, the Charlie Kirk of left-wing evangelicalism, right?
Nope.
Like we're not here to start like creating new slurs and start creating new terms that we can just undefinably throw around and be like, oh, that's it, even though there's no standard that we're coming off of, right?
Exactly.
And so I appreciate you kind of giving specific definitions, because we have to have a place that we're working from so we can know when to appropriately call something what it is, and also when to say, well, maybe Russell Moore, right, is more conservative in his theology, but that he's not a Christian nationalist, right? There's a separation there, for example. One more thing I want to ask, then we're going to get into some of the questions I have. Can you just briefly tell us, according to your latest research, where are we in terms of the American population as far as that ambassador, accommodator, and what are the other two categories that you have?
Rejectors and resistors.
Yeah, where are we on the spectrum of Americans right now when it comes to those folks and Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so this is something that we're talking about a lot, because I think the data, we've been at this long enough to where we've been collecting enough data and we've actually tracked down enough like broad data sources to be able to, I think, draw some conclusions about where this is headed.
Okay.
I think our indicators, we have good news and bad news. So like the good news is I actually do think the ambassador category is shrinking somewhat. I think you've got the true believers there, and there are a couple of reasons for that. So let me outline those two reasons. So like I think the two reasons we see the percentage of Americans in who would subscribe to, I think, ardent or like true believing Christian nationalism, I think, is diminishing for two primary reasons. One is because you've just got like demographic replacement. You've got older cohorts of Americans who just kind of said Christian nationalist things, like because that's their generation, like they're dying off, and the younger ones are raising up that want to distance themselves from that because they're also more secular to begin with. So like so that's just the process of like demographic secularization. That's just happening.
Right.
The other part of that, though, and maybe we can take some credit for this, is that as people are talking about Christian nationalism and it's become a thing, like we identify it, we talk about it, and for the most part, we are speaking about it negatively. It's not talked about like positively, with the exception of a very few pockets of like, you know, I think prominent leaders. And I think you've got Americans that previously might have otherwise just affirmed Christian nationalist things because they felt like, well, that's just common, like good American, you know, Christian.
Right.
That's just what a Christian thinks. Like
right.
Now I think they're probably approaching those questions with a little bit more like circumspection and being like, you know, do I really think, that sounds like Christian nationalism and I don't want that. So we might have people kind of backing away from it a little bit. It's the same way they might back away from like affirming overtly racist kind of things, you know. The downside of that is that like maybe they still believe it, but they're just not affirming it on surveys. You've got some kind of social desirability bias going on, like they don't even admit it to themselves. The other bad news part of this. So the good news is that it's shrinking somewhat for various reasons. The bad news is that I think with that diminishing, like with that slight kind of like reduction in the percentage of the population that believes that, you've got a sense of like embattlement within that group that really does affirm it strongly. And they feel persecuted. They feel the potential is there for them to be radicalized and more militant. We actually have evidence that there's been some social psychology, some brilliant like social psychology research with experimental data that has shown that Christian nationalism ebbs and flows in response to threat. And so if you tell a
Mm,
group of like, say, white Christians that Christianity is going to be the minority religion by 2050, they actually respond with greater Christian nationalism. Because
right.
why? Well, because it's their way of like circling the wagons and being like, oh, okay, well, we need to make sure we defend our turf. This is America. This is a Christian nation. And so that being said, all it takes is a really like smart, influential, charismatic politician
Hmm.
to go up in front of those people and say, Christianity is being persecuted. It's under siege. We're under attack. We're so marginalized. And you actually stoke Christian nationalism within that population, especially if they start to embrace it unapologetically, which I think to some degree we're starting to witness a little bit.
Hmm.
And so, yeah. So I think that's kind of where we are. We're at this place. We're at this kind of midpoint where like I think you've got a sorting going on. Like you've got people in the middle that are kind of getting out of the middle. In other words,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
you're either kind of like, where you stand on this and you're kind of either against it, or you are becoming the kind of American who is like, no, I really believe that. And that's who I am now.
Hmm. Okay. So do you have any like percentages of like, hey,
Mm.
roughly 20% are in this camp, maybe 30% are
Yeah.
in this camp? Like, how does that break down?
I still think you're looking at probably about 30% accommodators.
Okay.
And then you've got maybe 15% ambassadors.
Okay. Okay.
So that's not the majority
Right.
that's not the majority of Americans, but like that's not an inconsequential like number of Americans.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and it depends on how you. So this is something that we're kind of digging into now. Sometimes it depends on how you ask these questions.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah. You
Pew
mentioned this.
Research Center, and I've been using these data a lot, and I love Pew. Like they make all their data public or most of it like after like a year or so. And which for me, I mean, like I'm just a data junkie. Like I just sit in front of like a computer with data all day long, and I just love playing around with that.
Wow.
And that's such a blessing to be able to kind of like dig into that and be like, okay, I got a question. I'm going to go into like my 6 data sets that I have kind of on hand to do this. And so Pew has made that. So Pew recently like did a study, I think October of last year, they published it, and it was on Americans' attitudes towards church and state. And they asked questions slightly differently. We consulted with them. Andrew Whitehead and I consulted with Pew on this. We helped them kind of write the questions, and they kind of took those ideas and ran with them. And what they decided was they were going to, instead of asking these level of agreement questions that we ask in our surveys, they decided to ask these either or questions. So for example, rather than saying, how much do you agree with the following statement? The US Constitution is divinely inspired. Like 1 meaning like totally disagree, 5 or 6 being like totally agree. They did something like, which one comes closest to your view? The founding documents like the Constitution are divinely inspired and God's intention for America, or the founding documents are great, but they're not divinely inspired. They found with that kind of like measurement, they found a slightly lower percentage of Americans that actually affirmed these really strong Christian nationalist statements. So that was actually like, it's kind of positive news. Like that was actually
Right.
like, okay, when forced to choose, Americans might be kind of backing away from this to some degree. But here's the upshot of that is that when they made their categories, kind of like our Christian nationalism scale, when they made their categories of like true believers of Christian, they called, I think church state integrationists, they called them. It was still about like 15-16% of Americans. So like similar to our ambassador category. So I think we're consistently seeing about 15-20% of Americans are these really hardcore buy-in guys.
Do you think is there a way as a sociologist to measure the power of a group, right? Because I think about how for only 15 or 20%, that's not that in some ways that could be a fringe group, right? It's 15% of the population, right?
Yep.
But in terms of power and influence of what they've been able to accomplish, I mean, the overturning Roe v. Wade is a great example. The majority of all Americans, except for white evangelical Protestants, support Roe v. Wade being law of the land, right? Yet somehow Roe v. Wade's been overturned. So the power and influence, and I think right now I'm channeling my inner Catherine Stewart, who wrote the book, The Power Worshippers, a great book that documents just some of the underground funding of these groups and how they work in churches. Is there a way to measure that as a sociologist of like, okay, maybe numerically they're small, but power wise, we can measure that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So one of the ways that you can influence this is you can look at this as in political activity. So like how often those people vote, how often those people are donating to campaigns, how often those people are like knocking on doors and handing out flyers and participating in these kinds of things. And I will say that the Americans who subscribe the most radically to Christian nationalist ideology are the ones who are the active ones. So here's just kind of like a lesson in political science, really quick.
Sure, go for it.
So this is actually like the pattern that we see is very similar to any kind of ideological commitment pattern, in that it's the extremes that are the most likely to get involved politically and to have that kind of influence. And so you've got with Christian nationalism, just like let's just say it's a spectrum of like very liberal to very conservative and moderates in the middle. You would see a U shape in terms of like political participation, like very conservative, very liberal. They're all very politically active. Whereas these moderates in the middle, like they're all kind of checked out. Like that's why they're moderates. They don't care. Like they're just kind of, they don't engage much.
Right.
Same with Christian nationalism. You've got the rejectors that are very concerned. You've got the ambassadors that are very concerned. And these kinds of mushy people in the middle are not that engaged. The problem is when you factor in age. And so like I'm writing a paper on this right now. When you factor in age of like who tends to be a rejecter of Christian nationalism, who tends to be an ambassador of Christian nationalism. Well, the rejectors of Christian nationalism tend to be younger Americans who, by the way, don't vote a lot and don't exercise a lot of influence. But the people who are very, very strong ambassadors of Christian nationalism tend to be these older cohorts of Americans who vote a lot, and they're very active politically. So you actually do have indicators that like the strong Christian nationalists are the ones, because of demographics, because of like the extremity of their views, they're the ones who are most likely going to be active in politics. So that's one indicator. But also, I think Catherine Stewart makes a great, Catherine Stewart, Anna Nelson, Sarah Posner. I think they have done great work looking at kind of like the back room kind of networks that are pulling all the strings in these kind of coordinated groups, like these. Jeff Charlotte, I mean, in his book The Family and his work subsequently, I think they have done a lot of work to show that like these people have been moving the pieces. They recognize, and this is actually why they have to do this. So they recognize that numerically their days are numbered, right? Like they realize like theirs is a diminishing percentage of the population. White evangelical Christians cannot hang on forever. Their fertility rates are declining just like everybody else, and they are, and they're losing younger cohorts of people as well. So what do you have to do? Well, you either, and I think I tweeted about this a couple of weeks ago, like, if you're in their position, you either have to change your views, which they don't want to do, or you can just die off and kind of take defeat, the slow defeat over time, or you can get very comfortable with the prospect of like having to rule from a minority position. And to do that, you have to strategically place leaders who will subvert democratic norms, subvert democracy. You have to, a judiciary looks really, really good, that like with lifelong appointments, that looks really strategic to you. And of course you want to lead from there, because you won't be able to elect them. And so you want to get them appointed for life.
That makes a lot of sense, because as I was reading Catherine's book recently, and her book was written, I think in 2020 or 2019. And she mentioned in the beginning, like, they want to change the court. And this was right when Roe v. Wade got overturned. I thought, oh my goodness, like this, she's a prophet. I reached out to her, actually, we talked for a bit, and it was really helpful to understand. I hate to use the term shadow network, because that brings up other kinds of things that, like conspiracy theories and stuff, but there is a real underground network that wants to stay hidden, that really is funding and mobilizing people, and they don't want to be brought out to the light, because I think if most people knew what they were doing and how they were really blurring the lines of their 501c3s and telling churches how to avoid accountability while still being able to advocate for politicians, it would be really problematic. Which brings me to my next question. How does it feel for you to see CNN's article, right, this past Sunday, as of this recording, really platforming Christian nationalism on their website to the point where it was actually trending on Twitter? Do you think that finally, right, I know it's taken time, but NPR did a piece that they actually asked me for a quote on it, and CNN, talked about it. Do you think I hate to use the term mainstream media, but the more popular media outlets, are they starting to pick up on this, you think? And is that good news for us? Or do you think ultimately it's only going to radicalize Christian nationalists even further?
Yeah, I mean, I'm as an academic, I'm always inclined to think more truth is better. I mean, I
Absolutely.
definitely subscribe to the Timothy Snyder kind of post-truth is pre-fascism kind of uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
idea,
Yeah.
and like I gotta commit to that, like and honestly, like I'm so committed to that idea that like if like I'm not even committed to my own measurements of these kinds of things. Like I hope other people develop better measures of Christian nationalism. I hope
Mm,
I want people to kind of like take our data and look at it and kind of run with these kinds of things and develop better ways of understanding these things. Because like to me, it's all about like, okay, is this is a thing. And I've seen enough data now to be convinced this is a thing. This is a very problematic thing that we need to address. And so as long as news associations, mainstream media, we're talking about it with like I think sober-minded questions.
yeah.
Not one of the things I'm most proud of the last 7 years is I think we tried to steer away the conversation from just white evangelicals all the time.
Yeah.
Uh, After 2016, I mean, you just look at all these. I kind of collected these after a while. Like you had all of these headlines about like white evangelicals, white evangelicals, white evangelicals. And we did all of this research and we showed that like after you account for Christian nationalist ideology, it's not really about being a white evangelical. It's the fact that white evangelicals buy into this ideology, and Trump played up that, hey, I will be the savior of Christianity. I will be the savior of like your kind of crew. So like, is it, like, and there may be some time in the not too distant future where like the Venn diagram of white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism is a circle. I don't think it's necessarily that yet. Just and not apologizing for the problematic elements of like traditional white evangelical kind of subculture, but
Can I
I
interrupt
just
you really quick on that? I'm
yeah,
sorry to
please go
interrupt
ahead.
you,
Yeah,
but that's
yeah,
a very interesting perspective because, obviously our account's called the New Evangelicals, and we do critique, I'm sure you see our tweets, white
yeah,
evangelicalism pretty often.
yeah,
Can you, and I do recognize that Christian nationalism is not just exclusive to white evangelicals. There are
right,
Catholic nationalists. Mormonism has very fundamentalist Christian nationalist roots.
sure,
I mean, I forgot the guy's name, but during the January 6th hearing, literally said, I believe the Constitution is divinely inspired. People were sending it to
yeah,
me saying, can you believe this Christian? I said, well, he is a Christian if you count the Mormon faith as part of the Christian tradition, because this guy's Mormon,
yeah.
and that was kind of one of those moments for people where they said, I think it was kind of a light bulb moment where they thought, oh, it's not just white evangelicals. But I do think that and I understand, Kristen Dumais brings up this point, and she makes a great point when she says it is hard to categorize what evangelicalism, let alone white evangelicalism, is. We understand that. Accounting for that, it seems like this culture of white evangelicalism is the most effective host of carrying the virus of Christian nationalism in
That's a good
terms
way to
of
say it.
political power. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good way to say it. And I think and a lot of that is like because of like white evangelical history, because of its connection to racism, because of its
Right.
connection to like these family values kinds of, I mean, Kristen Dumais, I think you said she outlines this so well. And I think another great book, we may have even talked about this one, but J. Russell Hawkins,
Oh, got it right
The
here.
Bible Told Him So.
Heck
I mean,
yeah.
I'm recommending this book to everybody. It's so
Same.
good, but it really does, I
Yeah,
think,
here it
just
is.
give,
Right here.
yeah, I mean, it like he kind of provides all of these receipts about like white evangelical Southerners, at least like kind of their connection to segregation theology into this colorblind theology that we see now.
Right.
Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way to say it. I think white evangelicalism, for a variety of reasons, their historical, contextual reasons, has been the best host for Christian nationalist ideology. And yet, I mean, then you've got your like evangelical never Trumpers who I think are trying
Yes.
who are trying to distance themselves from that kind of thing. You've got your Russell Moores and your Tim Kellers, who I'm not saying I agree with on everything,
Sure. Sure.
but I would point to them as people who are saying, hey, this is a really problematic trend and we need to critique this and we need to not kind of get in bed with this just because it scores political victories in the primary.
Right.
We
Right.
need to, if we're going to defend democracy as we understand it and have a real democracy, not just kind of like a puppet, like zombie democracy that like you have in Russia,
Right.
where like you have elections, but like they don't, like these aren't really elections anymore. Like that's just kind of how it happens. And so if we
Right.
were to avoid that fate, then I think we actually need to, acknowledge that like, hey, some evangelicals can be on team democracy here and champion their efforts rather than be like, yeah, you guys all suck. You're all,
Well,
uh,
I think about folks like Andy Stanley, who wrote the book Not in It to Win It recently, right? He's another one of these
I need to
more
read that one. I need to read that one.
it got really good reviews. I've heard good things. And I think about another person named John Mark Comer. Not sure if you know who he is.
Yeah, I do.
There are
Yeah.
certainly some evangelical leaders out there who I would say are either quiet or who are now starting to say, actually, we have to resist this, right? But I do think that your data that you suggest that we're seeing that kind of middle kind of get eroded makes a lot of sense, because Russell Moore lost like almost all of his positions at his former job. Tim Keller gets called out all the time from people for being too quote unquote liberal now or progressive, and so on and so forth. Right. And this is Tim Keller. I mean, he's quite conservative. So one of my questions I wanted to ask you was, I've noticed that, yes, while Marjorie Taylor Greene, we talked about this on Twitter, is now saying, hey, I'm a Christian nationalist, let's just embrace the title. I wouldn't be so concerned if I didn't see folks like Al Mohler say similar things on a podcast recently. And there's also another pastor I track, Samuel Duth of Awakened Church in San Diego, who also on a live recently said, yes, I'm a Christian nationalist, and mentioned dominionism almost by name, that we have to take, he said something to the effect of, as Christians, we have to take dominion of the culture. I go, oh, red flag alert. I know exactly what that means. So while again, I know your data, which thankfully says that this is not growing numerically, do you see a further radicalization of even those ambassadors going deeper down that rabbit hole of just saying, you know what, we're just going to embrace all this. We're just going to embrace the nationalism. We're going to embrace everything that comes along with it and just call it a day. Are you seeing that?
So I do think in politics, let me just separate like politics versus like the pastor kind of thing.
Yeah,
so
fair point. Fair.
So when you've got like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I would add several other, like in the primaries recently, like we had a Republican primary kind of in Oklahoma, and Jackson LaMayer is LAHMAYMEYER, who's a Pentecostal pastor who's running for James Langford. James Langford is just incredibly conservative Christian. I've heard him speak before. I wouldn't say he's a rabid Christian nationalist, just kind of typical evangelical, like, Republican senator from Oklahoma. And if you go to Jackson LaMayer's Twitter feed, I mean, it's just straight. Every other tweet is Christian nationalism, like overt. Like he might not like say I am a Christian nationalist, but he's definitely like Christian nation all over the place. Like this is what we're fighting for. And he came in second in the primary to Langford, right? Like, and there are other people like that who I think are maybe not the front runners, but they are part of that base and they're competing for that Republican base.
Yeah.
That now recognizes that in order to primary my opponent, I've got to smear them as a rhino. And to do that, I've got to pull as far right as possible. And in places like Oklahoma and other kind of like deep red states, that requires you kind of playing into that rhetoric. So you've got kind of what I was talking about earlier about Christian nationalism as a rhetorical strategy, where people can more or less believe it politically, but they know that kind of scores these points now that we're in this kind of really hyper polarized, us versus them kind of mindset. When it comes to the ministry and these pastors, you've got like Lance Wallnau. He's very much like dominionist Christian nationalist. You've got other pastors and leaders. I think it's unfortunate. Well, I think it's unfortunate that oftentimes the ones that get the play. I mean, I kind of joke about this sometimes. Is that like, maybe there was a time when like half of my requests for interviews from the media were like, hey, we want to talk to you about Christian nationalism. And I would be like, great, we have all of this data. We just collected all this like really systematic, rigorous kind of stuff. And they'd be like, yeah, we want to talk about Greg Locke. Tell us about Greg Locke. He's wacky. Do you follow him? Like he's,
Yes, he's wacky. Next question.
Yeah, well, it's so like, I hate that it ends up being like Christian nationalism ends up being Greg Locke. Just kind of like Christian nationalism is like the QAnon shaman with horns and like screaming and like in these kind of pictures.
Right.
Because that allows people to say, okay, those guys are nuts and nothing like people I know. When we're trying to tell them like, look, Christian nationalism is the dude sitting next to you at church, right? Like it's the pastor in front of you who is implying that we faithful Christians need to take back our country for people like us, rather than I think things that are just kind of more biblically defensible, like we need to kind of advocate for the values that we feel convicted over, like those kinds of things,
Sure.
in a way that doesn't like privilege Christianity above all and institutionalize our identity
Right.
as the only kind of legitimate, we are the true Americans, and these other religious people or irreligious people are here on our good graces.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I have found myself thinking like, I can't believe I have to say that I don't want my belief system enshrined in law at the expense of other people, considering we live in a pluralistic society. Like, guys, this is like 101, right? Like, the Bible
Like I'm
doesn't
saying,
govern
yeah,
us, right? Like the Constitution, First Amendment is very clear about this. So it is kind of weird to even feel like how saying that for some people is like, oh, well, you're not a real Christian then. Like, you don't
yeah,
believe that there's one way to heaven. It's like, we're not talking about theological implications. We're talking about how other people want to function in a society, and can we make room for them, right?
right.
So it is interesting. I did want to. I looked at a couple of your stats, and I know I joked with you before we started recording that I know I follow you on Twitter too much when I tried to bookmark something, and Twitter goes, you already bookmarked this, Tim. Like, it's already been saved. But I've been following some of your data. I have some questions about two of them in particular.
Sure.
One, you shared a percentage of Americans who hold different views on voter access across Christian nationalism, and you cite this stat that says, I'm going to read the two options here. Quote: citizens should have to prove they really want to vote by registering ahead of time, or everything possible should be done to make it easy for every citizen to vote. So this is like literally a constitutional guarantee that you have the right to vote. To
Right.
put it in maybe Christian nationalist language, the right shall not be infringed. Okay, let's just put it
Yeah,
that way. But
that's right.
in the data you shared, let me see here. My mic is cutting out. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, it could be on my end. The data you shared here, though, it looks like what, 72% of Republicans hold the first view that citizens should have to prove they really want to vote by registering ahead of time, and it looks like 80% of Democrats, I guess, or
Right.
liberals, however you.
No, actually, I should have, just to correct,
That makes
I,
sense.
I probably shouldn't have color coded them that way, because I think that might
Okay.
have given the impression that I'm talking Democrat versus Republican.
Yes.
So what it actually shows is that when we're talking about like all Americans, about 60% of Americans say uh, we should do everything possible to make voting as easy as possible, right? Like
Okay.
40%, the other 40% say Americans should have to prove that they really want to vote by, no, actually it says citizens. Citizens
Right.
should have to prove they really want to vote by registering ahead of time. So what I meant to show is like, all in all, like the majority of Americans, the large majority of Americans believe that access is important and it's most important. And you shouldn't have to prove, citizens shouldn't have to prove that, it's a right. You're guaranteed, you should be guaranteed access to vote because it's a right, not necessarily a privilege that you have to work for or earn. But as Christian nationalism increases, and that's kind of what I show in this chart, as Christian nationalism increases, you're more likely to say voting is something that you should have to prove that you are kind of worthy of.
Okay.
And as Christian nationalism, you're less likely to say that we ought to we ought to make everybody's access a priority to voting. That is a very
Gotcha.
Christian nationalist way of seeing things, because if you subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology, you don't believe that even the citizens of this country like should have the equal say that you do. You believe that there is, even among citizens, they get divided into worthy and unworthy. Those who have proved themselves worthy to have that kind of access, and those who have not. And I quoted Paul Weyrich in that tweet because Paul
Right.
Weyrich, the founder of the co-founder of the Moral Majority and the Heritage Foundation, and all of these other ALEC, all of these other groups that have actually tried to pass legislation to limit voter access. He said in 1980 this famous quote, I don't want to make it, I don't want everybody to vote. He said, elections aren't won by the majority of the people, and they never have been. He says, our leverage in the election quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. He said this in front of a bunch of like evangelical Christians and Ronald Reagan at the time.
Right.
And so that kind of is I think the Christian nationalist mantra when it comes to this is like, you really don't prioritize access because you don't prioritize democracy. It's not about like ensuring that everybody has access to influence their government. It's more about the right people influencing
Yeah.
government, people like us.
Yeah. Okay. The other one I wanted to hit, and I think this one to me really was kind of, when I saw the data, I went, well, this makes so much sense, but I never thought about it like this. It's the
Yeah.
percentage of Americans who believe it's more important to overcome differences to address common problems or to overcome our opponents across political ideology. If I'm reading this one correct, tell me if I'm wrong, 64% of, quote, very conservative folks believe that it's more important that they overcome opponents who are leading in the wrong direction, compared to 72% of very liberal folks who say it's more important that we overcome our differences to address our common problems. That's a very stark difference on how we move forward as a country. One, it seems like, wants to take over and eradicate their, I guess, quote unquote enemy, right? Their opponents. And the other one says, well, maybe we can try and find some way forward by working together. Am I reading that
Yeah.
stat correctly?
No, spot on. And that actually, I mean, that one kind of like threw me back a little bit, just the stark difference, because sometimes there is a perception in politics that I think, or just maybe not even politics, because I think political scientists are now very aware of what we would call asymmetrical polarization. That is, Republicans and conservatives generally have moved to the right faster than liberals have moved to the left, or Democrats have moved to the left. So like Democrats tend to be mostly moderate still. Like,
well, look at Joe Biden. He's pretty much a moderate, almost Eisenhower Republican. He's not that far left.
Well, think about the last 3 Democratic presidents. Bill Clinton was like, he would be a Republican today, or like he wouldn't even be a Republican today. Like he definitely wouldn't be he would be a moderate Republican today. Bill Clinton would be like, he would be Mitt Romney. Like that's Bill Clinton. Like Barack Obama was not a radical leftist, as much as they tried to paint him as one. Like he was, I think a lot of leftists would very much so object to the accusation that Barack Obama was a leftist. And same with Joe Biden, this moderate guy. So that is actually where, and I tweeted this out a couple of weeks ago. Pew, it was either Pew or Gallup, maybe it was Gallup. They had this really fascinating statistic. They did a survey, and they basically asked Americans, would you prefer your own party to become more moderate, more liberal, or more conservative? And they found the majority of Democrats actually said they wanted the Democratic Party to become more moderate. It was like 55%. They wanted the Democrats to become more moderate. Whereas like 55% of Republicans said they wanted the party to be more conservative. Like in other words, like when you talk to the average Republican, there is increasing ideological purity within that party. That if you're a part of that party, you're conservative and you're moving towards kind of like very conservative.
Right.
Democrats are still this kind of broad coalition of like, you've got liberals, but you've also got like very just moderate people who are, so all that to say, like that is the Democrats and I think liberals generally are the party of like, hey, can we cooperate and solve some common problems? Can we band together? Like they're more into like the idea that like government could be useful to solve some problems that we have.
Right.
Whereas Republicans are very much like, I think the data suggests that they're very much into an us versus them binary now. That like either that us winning requires them to lose, and them winning means that we always lose.
Well, I think it's telling, and I'm going to try and get this episode out pretty quickly because I think it's important to have the conversation as much in real time as possible. But as of this recording, Turning Point's Student Action Summit happened this past weekend, which was a real cluster. And honestly, there's no other way around it. Like I follow all of those, and they only get shockingly worse every single time. And something that Charlie Kirk said, I have the clip where he pretty much said what you just said. He said, the radical left wants us to wave the white flag, but we're going to outcreate them. We're going to out-organize them. We're going to defeat them. And there's no middle ground. There's no compromise, right? There's only one option: to win. And then he says at the end that they are the invaders and we are the true Americans. That's what he says. I swear to God, I have the clip. I can share it to you.
I gotta look that one up.
Oh, whenever you need clips, my friend, just hit me up. They're all saved for a reason. I screen record before they get deleted or get banned, But I mean, when you have someone who represents so much of where I think Republicans are going, Charlie Kirk is only 29, 28. He is the future. Whoa, terrifying, because I think about myself, maybe, I think I'm definitely way more quote unquote progressive, but I mean, I think about like universal healthcare. I'm like, listen, I'm not saying it has to happen one way, but can we have the conversation? I'm open to solutions on this, but our healthcare problem is terrible in America. But that doesn't seem to be the posture of so many conservatives that I engage with, either in my previous life at my church, or online, or what I see coming from the leaders, either the more evangelical conservatives like the Franklin Grahams, or
Right.
these more political conservatives using evangelical language. It just seems like it's very much that Trumpism of win, 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 defeat, destroy our enemies, get rid
Yeah.
of the invader, and that has consequences. I'm thinking about Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works.
Yeah.
I mean, if
Oh
that's
man.
not like right out of the playbook,
Right out of it.
that's what scares me, frankly.
Yeah.
And the last thing I want to get your thoughts on, I'll let you respond to all this, is that
Yeah.
I have been following the January 6 hearings, and it concerns me maybe more than the actual insurrection itself in a lot of ways, to see how so many conservative folks, and how much of this conservative media empire is doing everything they can to really discredit the reality of what happened and all of the data that the hearing pushes and shows every single time. I'm thinking about how Charlie Kirk believes that the election was stolen. Dinesh D'Souza, Ali Stuckey, platformed a lady named Julie Kelly. We did on our end a 3-hour response to her podcast, just going through line by line, trying to show where the propaganda was. That I think that a lot of this is wrapped up in all of this, in this Christian nationalist ideology. Any thoughts, any insight to this? Have you thought about that? Have you been seeing this? Would love your reaction.
I think since 2016, what worked was this outrage identity kind of based. Uh, uh, what was the Claremont Institute? Charge the cockpit or you die, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
the
Hmm.
it's the we only have one choice, and that is victory, and anything else is compromise and defeat. And I think that is kind of where that kind of like ideological and idea, and I would even say it's ideological. Like I'm persuaded by Ezra Klein's recent book, like how why we're polarized.
Oh,
I've gone through that a couple of times. It's a great book. He does a great job of distilling a lot of the things that we're talking about. And one of the things that he talks about is that, like, Republicans aren't so much led by ideology as much as they are identity now. Like this is who we are, and every kind of like every challenge is an identity challenge. It's like a challenge to who we are as a people and what we're about.
right,
Not necessarily because we have these kinds of like deep values, or we have it's like it's Trump. Who cares about values anymore? Like
right,
it's just win, like it's just us. They are the intruders, we are they are the assailants, the outsiders, we're the good
right,
guys.
right.
And like you said, it's just out of Jason Stanley's How Fascism Works. I mean, it's just that kind of us versus them binary, I think, feeds into this hyper polarized thing where you would rather, I mean, this is what's going to happen. You would rather vote for Satan himself than to vote for than to even allow the possibility
Yeah,
that some moderate candidate from the other party would be the better option, because it's the stakes are
right,
that high now.
right. And maybe just some of your personal thoughts on this, but I feel like if I resist this, I get labeled like far left progressive. And I'm like, guys, I swear there is no Joe Biden flag anywhere in my house. There's not one on the back of my truck. It's never
Right,
going to happen.
right,
I don't care if he runs again. I hope he doesn't personally,
right,
but it just seems like you're just pushed into this. Okay, well, either you're this far right Trump lover, or you're just a far left, Marxist. And it's like, guys, resisting or saying the election was not stolen should
right.
not be a radical comment, but it feels radical to say, or to say,
Oh,
hey, maybe the government should play a role in helping to reduce our climate footprint, our
right,
carbon footprint. Oh, what are you, a crazy Marxist? No, this is like, I mean, from a Christian point of view, this is pretty
right,
biblical.
right.
I do you feel that kind of like,
Well, I feel those.
gravitational pull?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I feel those polls, and I think the good news to that is, I think a lot of research suggests that is primarily coming from the very, very loud, vocal, present, group of people on Twitter or social media that says you really have to be one or the other. I
Right.
really will say, like, the good news about most of this is that Americans are slowly, as demographic replacement happens, we are slowly trending leftward as a country in terms of like just social values and those kinds of things, like in a variety of ways. So like that is happening. And most Americans still are, if you're familiar with kind of this bell curve
Yep.
image, most Americans still are in the bell, like most Americans are in this kind of moderate place. But in terms of identity, we are like, as far as the Republicans go, like I think we are seeing this kind of like rightward shift in the tail to where that's fattening it out and they're moving towards more extremes. Democrats are doing that slightly, or the left is doing that slightly, but not to the extent that Republicans have done so. So you have this situation where like uh, a majority of Americans are moderate and they are not Republican, and yet the loudest and scariest and persuasive to the extent that they are the loudest and the most motivated to kind of like get their message out there and manipulate information.
Right.
They're the
Yeah.
ones who are very active, like Charlie Kirk said. I mean, we're going to out-create, we're going to
Organize.
out-organize. I mean, you've got the Chris Rufos of the world that like basically brag about like, we're changing language. We just do it. Like, we don't even like, he's telling us, like he says, like, we'll just make Christian, we'll make CRT everything. Where anytime somebody hears something that sounds weird, they'll be like CRT, and then we'll own it, and he just kind of gives the playbook away. But that is exactly the whole script for everything now.
Yeah, it is interesting to watch that culture go from, you can't redefine marriage, marriage has one meaning, to, oh, we'll just redefine everything else that we don't like. I mean, even the term
Right.
woke comes from the Black culture. It's totally appropriated
Right.
to become a slur, which is just, anyway, different discussion. Okay, last question for me, kind of a fun one. So I gotta know, like, are you the kind of person where it's dinner time and you're just looking over stats because you just love reading data? I mean, do you really love the data? Are you just, you're on vacation, you can't get away from thinking about it? Is that how you are? I just need to know that.
No, that's a good question. I am definitely somebody who loves my job more than anybody has a right to love their job. I will say, like, my wife and my kids are very much like, when it's their time, it's their time. And so like, I can't really, I don't have in other words, I don't have my laptop in kind of social spaces around the house. I'm at my house right now, and I do not walk around with like, I think that's probably Ryan Burge. I don't want to speak for Ryan Burge, but like that guy is so active with the stuff. Like, I will send him a message on Twitter. If you don't, people who are listening, follow Ryan Burge on Twitter. He's amazing. But I'll send him a message on Twitter, just like a DM, and I'll ask him a question like, hey, do you have data on this kind of thing? And like 10 minutes later, he'll send me just this pristine, beautiful, computer programmed kind of like chart where he's done all these things. And I am not nearly as accessible, but I love, like, I think what got me into this kind of line of work is I'm just, I'm super curious, and I hate the idea of, like, there's a place for anecdotes and there's a place for our own kind of experience speaking into this. But if we have access to systematic data and information on these various questions, I want to know, because people want to know, and that's helpful for everybody. So hopefully that's helpful for other people, and I've made a little career out of it, so I'm glad to do it.
Well, I could definitely say it truly is helpful. It's always a pleasure talking to you and having you on, the podcast, just to kind of give the community that we are a part of just an update of like what's going on, what's the data say. And it's helpful because a lot of people, we expose this. Sometimes maybe I'm a little too focused on it, to be frank, but we there's just so much to expose when it comes to this and how embedded it can be into our own tradition. And I get pretty often, this is so discouraging, I'm just so bummed. And I say, listen, I'm not telling you this to discourage you. I'm telling this to motivate you. Let if you're a little angry, good. Let that give you some motivation to want to change things, right? And so I think it's important that while certainly this can be discouraging, it's important for the audience to know that the reason why we talk about this so much, and we have folks like Samuel on and others unpacking this, is because it matters, and it's part of loving our neighbor. I mean, frankly, as a white Christian male, this is not going to really affect me a whole lot. Roe v. Wade has no effect on me. It just doesn't, right? But it has effect. It affects my partner. It affects my neighbors. And so for the sake of our neighbor and for the sake of the community that we're a part of, I almost feel like, and I'm just speaking, from my own personal view here, but like part of the work I do now is almost like my repentance, and just saying, hey, I was a part of some of this for a long time. And I want to be able to now kind of raise the alarm bells of like, we should be aware of what's happening in this particular strand. I'm a Christian. I'm a Jesus follower. I love the Bible. I love thinking about better ways of becoming a Christian. I love all of that stuff, deeply committed to a resurrected Jesus. But this particular strand of Christianity is so potentially dangerous to really not even just our society, but to the world, that I think it's important that we do our best to expose it. So that's why we do it, friends, if you're listening to it. And Sam, I really appreciate you coming on, especially on such short notice. It means a lot. Of course, keep in touch. I'm sure we'll have another dialogue at some point with another update.
Sure. Sounds great. Thanks for having me. It's a privilege.
Talk to you soon.